I woke up tied to a kitchen chair like a criminal in my own house, and my son told me it was for my own safety. But the truth is, they wanted me silent, still, and invisible. That's how the night began, and I don't think I'll ever forget the way the rope bit into my wrists, the coarse fibers scratching my skin, while the people I raised and trusted moved around me as if I were nothing more than furniture. I am 72 years old, and in that moment, staring at the shadow of my own reflection in the window glass, I realized that age had become their excuse, their weapon, the label they used to justify taking everything from me. My freedom, my voice, my dignity. They thought no one would see, no one would care, because who listens to a black grandmother when she says her own blood is abusing her? They believed they were safe in their cruelty. What they didn't know was that across the yard, in the neighbor's porch light, a small lens was watching, capturing every knot they tied and every cruel word they muttered. The house smelled of leftover takeout, grease, and stale wine, but the strongest scent in the air was contempt. My daughter-in-law laughed as she pulled the rope tighter, saying I liked to wander at night, that she was only protecting me from hurting myself. My son didn't look at me. He stood behind her, nodding like a boy desperate for his wife's approval, ashamed to meet my eyes, afraid to see the woman who worked 3 jobs so he could go to college, the woman who cleaned houses by day and sewed uniforms by night, the woman whose hands still carried scars from scrubbing white folks' floors. I tried to speak, to say that I didn't need this, that I wasn't confused, that I was still here, still sharp. But the words caught in my throat. My dignity was being smothered by their laughter. I remember the clock on the microwave flashing 12:07, blue digits in the dark, as if the night itself wanted to record the time my life shifted from uneasy coexistence to outright captivity. I had felt the disrespect growing for months. Little barbs slipped into conversations. "You don't remember right, Mama." Or, "Sit down, let us handle it." Then came the locked cabinets, the missing pension checks, the way my bank card would mysteriously be declined while my son drove a new car I knew he couldn't afford. Every act chipped away at me, but I told myself I could endure, that he was still my child, that maybe stress was twisting him. But this act of binding me like an object, was not stress, not misunderstanding. It was domination. It was cruelty wrapped in the language of care. I could hear the television from the living room, some late-night comedy show blaring canned laughter that mixed with my daughter-in-law's real cackle. I sat stiff in that chair, cold creeping into my bones, wrists burning, and I thought of my own mother, who used to warn me that family can sometimes turn into strangers wearing familiar faces. I had brushed her words aside back then, but as I listened to my son say, "She won't even remember this tomorrow," my mother's warning echoed inside me like gospel. They thought they could rewrite me, reduce me to a fragile mind and failing memory. But I knew every detail, every sound, every insult. And the worst part wasn't the rope or the humiliation. It was realizing that they wanted me erased, alive but voiceless, present but powerless. I wanted to scream, but I knew that screaming would give them exactly what they wanted, a picture of me as unstable, hysterical, delusional. So I swallowed my rage like bitter medicine, and I sat, quiet, watching the moonlight stretch across the linoleum, remembering the marches I joined when I was a girl, the days we stood against police dogs and fire hoses, the nights we sang for justice under broken streetlights. Back then, silence was a weapon used against us, and we fought with noise, with song, with chants, with voices raised until they couldn't ignore us. And now, decades later, I was gagged, not with cloth, but with contempt, forced into silence in my own kitchen. But God works in shadows too. Across the yard, mounted above the neighbour's porch, was a small, almost forgotten security camera. I had seen it months ago when she asked me to water her plants while she visited her sister. "It's motion activated," she explained, "just in case someone tries to break in." That little lens blinked red in the night, and I remembered it as my son leaned down to check the knot on my ankles. He smirked, proud of himself, convinced he was in control. He never once thought that his actions were being recorded, that every frame was telling a story he thought no one would hear. Hours felt like days. My shoulders ached, and I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to keep myself from breaking. I thought of the generations of black women before me, women who bore children only to be told those children weren't theirs to raise, women who carried burdens silently, women who survived not because they were unbreakable, but because they refused to stay broken. I thought of them, and I promised myself that if I made it through this night, I would not stay quiet. I would not let them bury me alive under the label of old and confused. When they finally untied me in the morning, sunlight slicing through the blinds, my wrists were raw and my legs trembled as I tried to stand. My daughter-in-law shoved a mug of coffee into my hands as if nothing had happened. "You fell asleep at the table again," she said sweetly, her words dripping with poison. My son kissed her cheek, refusing to meet my gaze. They thought the night had vanished, swallowed by my supposed forgetfulness. They thought I would stay silent, but silence has never been my language. And they didn't know that while they laughed, while they tied me, while they erased me in their own minds, a witness was watching. A camera across the yard, a neighbour who checked her recordings in the morning, and a truth too sharp to stay buried. The morning after that night should have been like any other. Yet when the ropes fell away from my skin and I was left rubbing the red marks around my wrists, I knew something irreversible had shifted between me and the people I once called family. My daughter-in-law hummed as she prepared breakfast, pouring orange juice into glasses as if she had not bound me to a chair only hours earlier, and my son busied himself with his phone, tapping and scrolling, deliberately avoiding my eyes, pretending to be too consumed by business emails to acknowledge the silence that weighed down the kitchen. They both behaved as though the night's cruelty were a dream, a phantom of my own mind, and they expected me to play along, to swallow my questions and fold my pain into the same quiet corner where they had tried to store me. The smell of burnt toast filled the room, and the sound of cutlery against plates became unbearable, because beneath the ordinary routine lay the grotesque truth that they were rewriting reality, erasing evidence with smiles and casual words. When I dared to ask what had happened, why I had woken up tied down, my daughter-in-law looked at me with that patronizing tilt of her head, her voice drenched in false sympathy, saying that I must have dozed off at the kitchen table again, that she found me leaning forward and was simply worried I would fall. She said it lightly, with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, and added that I was lucky she cared enough to make sure I was safe. My son cleared his throat and muttered something about memory lapses being normal at this age, the phrase sliding from his tongue like oil, slick and impossible to hold. The worst part was not the lie itself, but the way they expected me to accept it, to nod in agreement, as though I were grateful to them for humiliating me. They were testing me, seeing if I would choose silence over confrontation, and when I refused to answer, they exchanged a glance, a private signal, and I realized they had already decided who I was going to be in their story. A fragile, unreliable woman whose words could be dismissed as confusion. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed that I had once bought for my son when he first moved back into my house after his divorce. I traced the grooves of the wood frame with my fingertips and wondered how many sacrifices I had made in the name of love and duty, sacrifices that had turned into weapons in their hands. I thought about my pension check that disappeared into an account I never saw, about the letters I received from the bank that I was not allowed to open, about the way my daughter-in-law always volunteered to manage my medications and then scoffed when I asked for explanations. They had built a cage around me disguised as care, and tying me to that chair was simply the most honest version of what they had been doing for months. For a long time I sat there, my heart beating like a drum in my chest, and I whispered to myself that I would not let them take the last pieces of my dignity. Later that afternoon, while the house was quiet and my son and his wife were gone, there was a knock at the back door, a hesitant tap that almost disappeared beneath the rustle of leaves outside. I opened it to find my neighbor, a woman I had spoken to in passing for years, holding a small flash drive in her hand. She looked nervous, as if she had stumbled into something bigger than she wanted, but her voice was steady when she told me she had a security camera aimed across her yard. She said she often used it just to keep an eye on raccoons or the occasional prowler, but when she checked the footage that morning, she had seen something that disturbed her deeply. She hesitated before handing me the drive, as though unsure whether giving it to me might place her in the middle of trouble she did not want. Yet she pressed it into my palm all the same. "You should see this," she whispered, her eyes filled with sorrow and quiet fury. When I plugged it into the old laptop I kept on my desk, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely control the mouse. The screen lit up with grainy images, the timestamp flashing the same blue numbers I had stared at in the kitchen the night before. And there it was, the proof I had been denied, the undeniable truth of what they had done to me. I watched as my son and his wife looped the ropes around my wrists, their expressions casual, even amused. I heard their voices through the tinny speakers, my daughter-in-law joking that I looked like a restless child who needed to be taught a lesson, my son laughing nervously but not stopping her. And then I saw myself, slumped in that chair, my eyes wide with disbelief, and the sight of my own humiliation captured in digital permanence made me feel both broken and vindicated. For a moment I pressed my hand to my mouth, fighting back sobs, because no matter how cruel the act had felt in the moment, seeing it replayed, knowing it was real, knowing it was recorded, stripped away any lingering doubt. That video was not just evidence of abuse, it was evidence of a campaign to erase me. Without it, they could have continued to claim I was confused, that my mind was slipping, that I was imagining things. With it, I had something undeniable, something they could not silence with condescension or charm. But as I stared at the screen, I also understood the danger. If they knew this recording existed, they would destroy it, and they would find new ways to silence me, harsher ways, permanent ways. I copied the file onto another drive, slipped it into a jewelry box hidden under my clothes, and returned the original to my neighbor, thanking her with a grip that conveyed the weight of what she had given me. She nodded, saying softly that she had seen her own aunt mistreated in a nursing home, that she couldn't stand by and watch another elder suffer in silence. Her solidarity was like a spark in the dark, a reminder that even when family betrays you, sometimes strangers will stand where loved ones fall. That night, I lay awake thinking of the battles I had fought in my life, fighting to keep a roof over my child's head, fighting against bosses who paid me less because I was black and female, fighting against a world that told me I was too loud, too strong, too much. I had fought all my life, and now, in my 70s, I was being forced to fight again, not against the world outside, but against the very people who should have stood beside me. The weight of that betrayal pressed against my chest like a stone, yet beneath the pain was a growing fire, a stubborn refusal to let their version of me become the truth. They believed they had trapped me, but I had proof. I had truth. And I had one last reserve of strength left in me. As I drifted into a restless sleep, I promised myself that I would no longer endure in silence. The recording was more than a piece of evidence. It was my lifeline, my chance to speak in a world that so often silenced women like me. The next steps would be terrifying, I knew, because exposing them meant risking everything: my home, my security, perhaps even my safety. But I could not go back to being tied to that chair, reduced to nothing. The choice was made for me that night. They had forced me to fight, and fight I would, until the truth broke free into the light where no one could deny it. I knew that keeping the recording hidden was the only thing standing between me and the quiet erasure my son and his wife had planned for me. But knowing it and carrying the weight of it were two very different things. For days after my neighbor pressed that flash drive into my palm, I walked around the house with my shoulders tight, my heart hammering, and a dread that clung to me like a second skin. Every glance from my son felt sharper, every remark from my daughter-in-law more calculated, as if they could sense that something in me had changed, that the silence they had always counted on was cracking, that the old woman they dismissed as forgetful and docile was beginning to stir. I tried to pretend that nothing had shifted, to keep the rhythm of meals and chores, to smile faintly when they expected it. But inside I was rehearsing conversations, measuring risks, wondering when and how to reveal that I knew what they had done, and that I held in my possession the proof they thought could never exist. The escalation began one night, when the tension that had been simmering between us finally boiled over. I was sitting in the living room, the video playing silently on the laptop in front of me, when my son came in unexpectedly. His eyes went to the screen, and for a moment there was only stillness, the frozen image of him standing over me as I sat bound to that chair. His face drained of colour, and then flushed a deep, dangerous red. He lunged forward, slamming the lid shut with such force that the whole table rattled. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his voice low but trembling with rage. My daughter-in-law entered moments later, her eyes narrowing when she saw the look on his face, and in an instant she understood what he had seen. I sat very still, keeping my hands folded in my lap so he wouldn't notice how badly they were shaking. And I told him the truth, that a neighbour had a camera, that she had given me a copy, and that now there was no use pretending any more. He stared at me as though I had betrayed him, as though I were the one committing a crime. The shouting that followed could have shaken the windows out of their frames. He told me I was ungrateful, that everything he had done for me, paying the bills with my own pension money, managing the house I had bought decades ago with my labour, keeping me safe, was proof of his devotion, not his cruelty. My daughter-in-law stood behind him, her arms crossed, her mouth twisted into a smirk, feeding his anger with small phrases that stung like wasps. "She doesn't even know what she's doing anymore." "She'll ruin us. She's confused," he echoed her, saying I was delusional, that no one would believe me, that people would laugh at a 72-year-old woman claiming she was being abused. The fury in his eyes told me he believed his threats would frighten me back into submission, and perhaps he was right to think so, because fear did flood through me, fear that they would hurt me worse, fear that they would take the recording and destroy it, fear that they would lock me away somewhere no one could hear my voice again. But beneath that fear was something harder, forged in decades of survival, something he had clearly forgotten. I told him calmly that I had already made copies. I told him that destroying the laptop would not erase what had been saved, that what he had done was documented beyond his reach. For the first time since this ordeal began, I watched fear flicker in his eyes. He masked it quickly with rage, but I saw it, and that sight gave me the strength to stand my ground. He lunged for the laptop anyway, yanking it by the cords and throwing it against the wall until it cracked open like a broken shell. My daughter-in-law clapped her hands together, as though that small act of violence had solved everything, and she turned on me with a sugary voice, saying, "Now stop this nonsense before you embarrass yourself further." I wanted to laugh, because they truly thought the destruction of one machine could erase the truth, but I swallowed it back, knowing that revealing too much too soon would only escalate the danger. I kept silent about the copy hidden in my dresser drawer, silent about the second copy entrusted to my neighbour, silent about the third I mailed to an old church friend across town with a note that simply said, "Keep this safe. It's important." In the days that followed, their hostility became open. My daughter-in-law began to lock doors to rooms that once were mine to enter freely, claiming she was organising the finances, protecting me from confusion, but I knew she was searching for the copy she could not find. My son grew colder, speaking to me only to issue orders, telling me to stay in my room, telling me not to leave the house without permission, reminding me in sharp tones that he held my bank cards, my identification, my prescriptions. Every move they made was designed to corner me, to strip away the little autonomy I had left, to force me into a corner where even with evidence I would have no way out. I felt the walls pressing in, yet every time despair threatened to swallow me, I reminded myself of that video, of the undeniable record of their cruelty, and I repeated to myself that silence was no longer an option. One evening, as my son sat in his leather chair, sipping whiskey paid for with my pension, I decided to confront him directly. I told him that I was going to the police. His laughter filled the room, loud and cruel, rolling over me like thunder. "You think they'll believe you?" he sneered. An old woman, confused and bitter, against me, a man with a career, a wife, a home? They'll think you're crazy. My daughter-in-law chimed in, saying she would tell everyone I had been wandering outside at night, hallucinating, losing time. She threatened to call Adult Protective Services herself, to paint me as incapable, to have me declared incompetent so they could place me in a home. They thought these threats would break me. Instead, they steeled my resolve. I told them that the days of me bowing my head were over, that if they wanted to take me down, they'd have to do it in public, with the world watching, because I would not go quietly. That night, I went to my neighbour again, my breath unsteady, and asked her to hold on to another copy of the video. She listened as I explained what had happened, her face tightening with each detail, and she promised that if anything ever happened to me, she would take it straight to the press. She was white, younger than me, with resources I didn't have, and for the first time in months I felt a glimmer of safety, knowing that someone outside my bloodline believed me and was willing to stand beside me. Still, going back inside the house was like walking into a lion's den, every creak of the floorboards making my stomach twist. My son's eyes followed me with suspicion, and my daughter-in-law whispered into her phone late at night, her voice sharp, her laughter brittle. I knew they were planning something, some new tactic, and the waiting gnawed at me. The escalation reached its peak when my son cornered me in the kitchen, his breath heavy with alcohol, his finger jabbing into my shoulder as he hissed that if I didn't hand over the copies, I would regret it. His face was inches from mine, his rage vibrating in every muscle of his body, and for the first time I felt the genuine possibility that he might strike me, that his anger might spill over into violence no recording could undo. My daughter-in-law stood in the doorway, watching, her expression cold, a silent accomplice. I lifted my chin and told him plainly that if he touched me, if he harmed me further, the video would not just go to the police, but to every news station in the city, that their faces and names would be known not as caretakers, but as abusers. For a moment, silence fell, heavy and suffocating, as he searched my eyes for a lie. When he found none, he stepped back, muttering curses, slamming cabinets, retreating to his room like a boy who had lost control of his own home. In that silence, I realized something profound. The fear had begun to shift. It was no longer only mine. For the first time, he and his wife were the ones unsettled, the ones second-guessing, the ones looking over their shoulders. They still had power, yes, but they no longer had the comfort of certainty. They knew that at any moment the world could see them for who they truly were. That knowledge was my weapon, fragile yet potent, and I held on to it with everything I had. I did not yet know how I would escape their grip, or how I would bring the truth into the light, but the escalation had set a new course. There was no going back to silence, no pretending the ropes had not burned my skin, no letting them dictate the story. I was old, yes, but I was not invisible. And with that recording, I had the means to prove it. That was the first escalation. The moment when the private cruelty they thought could be buried became a shared secret between us, a volatile truth neither side could ignore. From that night on, every word, every glance, every breath carried the weight of that knowledge. They had tied me down to erase me, but instead they had unleashed a fight they could never fully control, a fight that was only just beginning to burn. The night after my son threatened me in the kitchen, I sat awake in the dark of my bedroom with the faint glow of the streetlight sneaking through the blinds, thinking about how close his face had come to mine, how hot his breath had felt on my cheek, how his finger jabbing into my shoulder had carried all the contempt and fury that years ago he would have reserved for strangers who hurt me. Not for me. His mother. That memory replayed in my head like a record I could not switch off, and though fear was still there, pressing into my chest and making my pulse race in the quiet of the house, another feeling was growing alongside it, something steadier, harder, born of both exhaustion and defiance. I was tired of being a ghost in my own home, tired of being told that my mind was failing when it was sharper than theirs, tired of shrinking myself just to survive another day in the place I had worked all my life to hold on to. By the time dawn slid pale and grey across the sky, I had decided that I could no longer wait for a perfect moment to act, because the perfect moment would never come. I had to take what I had, the proof saved on that flash drive, and put it before someone with the authority to intervene. So I dressed carefully, choosing a neat blouse and a cardigan, combing my hair until it lay smooth, doing everything I could to make myself appear steady, reliable, unshakable. Because I knew that in a society like ours, especially for a black woman, my age, appearance was not vanity but survival. People see what they want to see, and if I showed up looking the way my abusers described me, frazzled, scattered, weak, then they would nod along with the narrative my son and his wife were already spinning. I slipped the flash drive into the deepest pocket of my purse, wrapped my scarf tight against my throat as if to armor myself, and stepped outside into the cool morning air. The walk to the bus stop felt endless, every car passing by making me nervous that my son might appear, demanding to know where I was going. But the further I got from the house, the lighter I felt, as though with each step I was reclaiming pieces of the independence they had stolen. When I entered the police station, the smell of stale coffee and paper hit me, and behind the counter sat a young officer scrolling on his phone, his face lit by the glow of the screen. I cleared my throat, introduced myself, and said I wanted to file a report of elder abuse. He glanced at me, his eyes sliding over me with a mix of boredom and irritation, and asked flatly, "Do you have an appointment?" as though seeking protection from cruelty required scheduling. I explained again, more firmly this time, that I had been restrained against my will, that I had proof on video, that my son and daughter-in-law were systematically stripping away my autonomy, and that I feared for my safety. He finally looked up fully then, not with the urgency I had hoped for, but with a skeptical squint, the kind of look that says, "I've already decided what you are," before you finish speaking. He asked if I had a medical diagnosis of dementia, if I had ever been hospitalized for confusion, if perhaps I had imagined being tied up in the fog of sleep. Each question was a dismissal dressed up as procedure, and the longer I stood there, the clearer it became that he had no intention of helping. Still, I placed the flash drive on the counter and told him to watch it. He reluctantly plugged it into a computer, and I stood trembling, waiting for the sound of my daughter-in-law's laughter, the sight of the ropes being tied to do what my words could not. But instead of outrage, instead of action, he frowned, leaned back in his chair and said, "Looks like maybe they were just keeping you safe." Sometimes families gotta make tough decisions. His words cut through me like a blade. The proof I thought was undeniable was being twisted in front of me into justification, as though my own humiliation and pain could be rebranded as care. He slid the flash drive back across the counter and told me he'd make a note of my complaint, that someone might follow up, but his tone made clear that nothing would come of it. I left the station with my purse heavier than before, my heart pounding with the realization that the system I had believed might rescue me was ready to bury me deeper instead. The bus ride home felt like exile. I watched the city pass by, people rushing to jobs, mothers holding their children's hands, teenagers with backpacks and headphones. And I thought about how invisible women like me become once the world decides we are no longer useful. I had fought too many battles in my lifetime to be silenced now, but I understood more than ever that official channels would not save me. The midpoint of my struggle had arrived, and it was not the police station, but the recognition that justice would only come if I forced it into the light where the system could not look away. When I stepped off the bus and walked toward my street, I saw my neighbor waiting on her porch. She had a phone in her hand, her face pale but determined, and she beckoned me over quickly, whispering that she had taken the liberty of uploading a short clip from the footage to her social media. At first I was horrified. Fear surged through me at the thought of my private pain becoming public spectacle. But she pressed the phone into my hand and told me to look. There it was, the 30-second clip of me tied to that chair, my son smirking, my daughter-in-law tugging the rope, their voices sharp and mocking. The post was already filling with comments, hundreds of them, people outraged, people demanding accountability, people asking how anyone could treat their mother like that. Some wrote that it reminded them of their own families, that they too had seen elders dismissed and abused, that finally someone had captured it on camera. I handed the phone back, my hands trembling, unsure whether to feel exposed or vindicated, but my neighbor said gently, "They can dismiss your words. They can dismiss the police report. But they can't dismiss this when the whole world is watching." I knew she was right, though terror pressed in around me, because I also knew that once my son and his wife saw that clip spreading, they would come for me harder than ever, desperate to shut me up before the entire recording reached more eyes. Yet as much as I feared their retaliation, I also felt a pulse of hope, small but undeniable, beating through the fear. For the first time, strangers were seeing what I had lived, and their outrage was a chorus louder than the contempt I endured daily in that house. That night, when I returned home, the atmosphere was electric with menace. My son slammed the front door shut behind me and demanded to know what I had done. His face twisted with panic more than anger now, his voice rising in a pitch I had never heard before. My daughter-in-law waved her phone in the air, the video playing on loop, her eyes wide with fury as she spat accusations, insisting that I had ruined their lives, that I had made them a laughingstock, that I was destroying my own family. They raged at me until my ears rang, but beneath their rage I saw something new: fear. They were losing control of the story, and control was all they ever had. I did not respond to their screaming. I sat down in the chair they had once tied me to and stared back at them, silent, letting them see that I was no longer afraid to meet their eyes. Inside, I was trembling. Yes, but I knew that crossing this midpoint meant there was no turning back. The video was out, the world was watching, and the fight had shifted from private terror to public reckoning. What lay ahead would be brutal, perhaps even dangerous, but it would not be fought in silence anymore. They had underestimated me, underestimated the power of truth when it is dragged into the light, and underestimated the resilience of a black woman who had survived too much to die bound and erased in her own home. That was the moment I understood. My story was no longer just mine. It belonged to every woman who had been silenced, every elder dismissed, every voice forced into quiet. The midpoint of my fight was not surrender, but exposure. And though the path ahead was uncertain, I felt a strength rising in me that I thought I had lost forever. The days after the video clip spread online were a blur of voices, messages, and headlines that I could barely keep up with. But for every stranger who sent a word of support, for every neighbor who knocked gently on my door to say they were praying, for me, there came an equal wave of retaliation from inside my own house. My son and his wife moved with a frantic energy, whispering on their phones, making appointments with lawyers, slamming doors as they plotted their defense. I overheard enough to know that they had found an attorney who specialized in family law, a man who promised he could twist the narrative back in their favor. They would no longer pretend to ignore me or dismiss the clip as nothing. They would go on the attack, and their weapon of choice would be my mind, my age, and the prejudices the world already carried against women like me. It began with papers shoved under my nose, documents filled with language about guardianship and protection, legal terms that in practice meant stripping me of my independence. They claimed it was for my own good, that after the embarrassment I had caused them, it was proof I was no longer capable of sound decisions. My daughter-in-law sat across the table in the lawyer's office, smiling sweetly as she spoke of her concern for me, her voice trembling just enough to mimic compassion, but her eyes cold and glittering with calculation. My son nodded along, repeating rehearsed lines about how I had been confused, how I forgot where I left things, how I imagined events that had not occurred. I tried to speak, to remind the room that there was video evidence of them binding me to a chair, but the lawyer raised his hand and said in a patient tone that sometimes people misinterpret family interactions, that sometimes stress makes elders recall things differently. It was as though my words were smoke, insubstantial, vanishing before they ever landed. The cruelest blow came in court. I had believed that standing before a judge, with the truth in my hands, would finally tilt the scales toward justice. But as I sat there under the fluorescent lights, watching my son swear that he loved me, hearing my daughter-in-law insist that she had only ever cared for my well-being, I realized that the performance they gave was not for me, but for the system built to favor the young, the polished, the articulate. They dressed in their best clothes, they spoke in calm, measured tones, and they painted me as a confused old woman who had been manipulated by outsiders with an agenda. The lawyer gestured toward me with just the right mix of pity and condescension, calling me vulnerable, suggesting I was being used by neighbors and strangers who wanted attention, implying that the video had been taken out of context, that what World had seen was not abuse, but a clumsy attempt to protect me from myself. Each word twisted the knife deeper, because I could see in the judge's face that the seeds of doubt were taking root. When my turn came to speak, my voice shook, not from weakness, but from the effort of containing my fury. I told the judge everything: how they had seized my pension, how they had locked cabinets, how they had mocked me in my own kitchen, how the ropes had burned my wrists. I told him about the sleepless nights, the whispered threats, the laptop smashed against the wall. I looked him in the eye and demanded to be heard. Yet as I spoke, I could see the courtroom tilting away from me. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers, asking questions that circled back not to their actions, but to my capacity. Had I ever been treated for confusion? Did I ever misplace money? Did I sometimes lose track of the days? In that moment, I realized the cruel irony. The very fact of being 72, of living in a body that sometimes trembled with age, was being used to discredit the truth that burned clear in my mind. By the time the gavel fell, nothing was resolved, but everything felt stolen. The judge delayed his decision, citing the need for further evaluation, and my son's lawyer smirked as though the battle had already been won. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt the sting of injustice more deeply than I had when they first tied me to the chair. That act had been physical, cruel, humiliating. But this was erasure on a grander scale, the system itself conspiring to make me vanish, to turn my cries for help into proof of my supposed frailty. It was a betrayal not just by family, but by the very institutions meant to protect. Back home, the atmosphere grew darker. My son and his wife treated me with open contempt now, no longer hiding their disdain. They told me that soon the house would be theirs, that soon I would be placed somewhere appropriate, that no one would listen to me once the court papers were signed. They said it with confidence, because the system had given them reason to believe they were untouchable. And though fear still pressed against me, though despair clawed at the edges of my spirit, another fire smouldered beneath it all. I had lived long enough to know that injustice often strikes hardest just before the tide begins to turn. And though the courtroom had dismissed me, though the world seemed eager to label me frail and confused, I carried the truth like a flame in my chest, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. When the judge delayed his decision and the lawyer walked out of that courtroom with a smirk stitched across his face, it would have been easy to surrender, to accept that the weight of the system would always tilt against me. But surrender was not something my bloodline ever carried well, and by the time I stepped back into my house with my son's mocking laughter echoing in my ears, I felt not the collapse of my spirit, but the sharpening of it. The cruelty of that moment, being dismissed in front of a room full of strangers, became the fuel that pushed me forward. Because I understood then that silence and patience would kill me faster than their ropes ever could. The second escalation began not with me raising my voice, but with the voices of others, people I did not know, people who had seen the clip online and refused to look away, people who reached out to reporters, to activists, to organizations dedicated to protecting elders from the kinds of abuses families like mine were too often allowed to bury in private shadows. At first it was a trickle, just a phone call from a local journalist who wanted to confirm the story, who asked if I would be willing to talk on the record. My son intercepted the call, telling the reporter that I was confused. But the journalist, persistent and sharp, left a note at my neighbour's house, and within days she was sitting at my kitchen table while my son was at work, her recorder turned on, her notepad filling with details as I told her everything. She listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her questions precise. And when I handed her a copy of the video, her face tightened in outrage. She promised me that she would not let this story be twisted into pity or pathology, that she would make sure the world saw the truth for what it was: abuse, control, humiliation. That promise lit something inside me, a reminder that even if the system bent against me, the court of public opinion could sometimes force it back into balance. Within a week, the story ran not just locally but regionally, picked up by outlets hungry for proof of what so many already suspected: that elder abuse was not confined to nursing homes, that it happened in kitchens and living rooms, often at the hands of family members who smiled in public while inflicting cruelty behind closed doors. The article quoted my words directly, my face blurred, but my story clear. And alongside it ran still images from the video: me tied to the chair, my son smirking, my daughter-in-law tightening the rope. Those images spread like wildfire across social media, each share carrying them further, each comment adding pressure. And as the outrage grew, so did the fear inside my house, because for the first time my son and his wife were not in control of the narrative. They screamed at me, accused me of betraying them, but their fury only proved how rattled they were. Their response was to double down, to hire a public relations consultant who coached them on how to speak to cameras, how to cry at the right moment, how to call themselves victims of a misunderstanding. They appeared on local television, sitting side by side in their living room, telling the reporter that I suffered from dementia, that the video had been edited by malicious neighbors, that the world was attacking them unfairly. They spoke of their stress, their sacrifices, their endless efforts to care for me. My son even choked back tears, saying he loved me and only wanted what was best. Watching that broadcast from my neighbor's house, I felt my stomach churn with both rage and disbelief, because their performance was convincing enough to fool anyone who wanted to believe that abuse did not exist in homes like theirs. But then something shifted again. Other neighbors, emboldened by the coverage, began to step forward. One man who lived across the street admitted he had often heard shouting at night. Another woman confessed that she had seen bruises on my arms when I went shopping. And my neighbor, the one who had first given me the video, showed the journalist additional recordings from her camera, footage from other nights when the shouting carried through the walls, when I staggered outside with tears streaking my face, when my son dragged me back in by the wrist. Piece by piece, the story built itself into a wall of evidence that no amount of rehearsed tears could dismantle. The second escalation came to its peak when a major news channel picked up the story and ran a full segment, not just about me, but about the larger epidemic of financial and physical abuse faced by elders, particularly black women who were too often silenced by both family and institutions. The segment included interviews with advocates, legal experts, and even a retired judge who criticized the way my case had been handled, calling it a miscarriage of justice. Seeing that on television was like watching the tide turn, slowly but unmistakably, as the pressure mounted not only on my abusers, but on the system that had failed me. Inside the house, the hostility reached new levels. My son paced the floors like a caged animal, his phone glued to his ear as he called lawyers, friends, anyone who might help him regain control. My daughter-in-law grew crueler, spitting insults when we crossed paths, leaving my meals cold, slamming doors so hard the walls shook. One night, she hissed that if I had been smart, I would have kept my mouth shut, that soon they would find a way to have me declared unfit, no matter what the public thought. Her eyes glittered with the kind of malice that made me wonder if physical harm might come again, more vicious than before. And I slept lightly, clutching the phone my neighbor had given me, ready to dial her number at the slightest sound. Yet even as the danger grew inside, the outside world kept closing in on them. The journalist uncovered financial records showing that my pension checks were deposited directly into my son's account, that large purchases, a luxury car, expensive vacations, designer clothes, were made in his name during the very months I had been given scraps. The evidence of financial exploitation piled up alongside the footage of physical abuse, weaving together a story too strong to dismiss. And then came the real blow. City officials announced an inquiry, promising to investigate both the abuse itself and the court's mishandling of my initial complaint. For the first time, it felt as though the walls were closing in, not on me, but on them. The night I saw the news broadcast announcing the investigation, I allowed myself a moment of quiet triumph. I sat in my room, the lamp casting a soft glow over the worn quilt on my bed, and I whispered to myself that I had survived the storm long enough to see the beginning of justice. The fear was not gone. Far from it, because I knew they were desperate, and desperation makes people dangerous. But alongside the fear was a growing certainty that their reign of silence was over. They had tied me to a chair to erase me, but instead they had lit a fuse that was burning straight toward them, and nothing, not their lawyers, not their lies, not their staged tears, would stop it now. The escalation had transformed the story into something larger than all of us. A battle not only for my dignity, but for the dignity of every elder who had ever been silenced. Every woman told she was too old, too fragile, too confused to be believed. It was no longer just my fight, and that knowledge steadied me. I was not alone, and the proof of that was in every headline, every call from strangers, every neighbor willing to testify. They thought they had me cornered, but what they had really done was awaken a truth too powerful to stay hidden. And as the second escalation unfolded, I felt a strange calm settle in me, the calm that comes when you know the storm has shifted direction and is no longer only battering you, but is now turning against those who created it. The courthouse was packed in a way I had never seen before, the air thick with whispers, the shuffling of reporters setting up their cameras, the low hum of anticipation that rolled through the room like thunder before a storm. And as I sat there in the front row, my hands folded tightly in my lap, I felt the weight of all those eyes, not just on me, but on the truth that had been forced into the open after so many nights of silence. My son sat across the aisle with his wife, their lawyer between them, their clothes pressed and perfect, their faces pale but carefully arranged into expressions of wounded dignity. And if I had not lived under their roof, if I had not felt the bite of the ropes on my skin, I might almost have believed the image they projected. But I knew. And now the world knew. And the tension in the room was not about whether something had happened, but whether the court, after months of dismissal and doubt, would finally allow the truth to stand without distortion. When the prosecutor began, her voice was steady but sharp, laying out the facts in a cadence that built like a drumbeat. The financial records showing the siphoning of my pension into my son's accounts, the testimony of neighbours who had heard the shouting and seen the bruises, the statements from advocates who spoke about the patterns of elder abuse too often ignored. Each piece stacked on top of the other until it formed a mountain of evidence that could no longer be dismissed as imagination or confusion. And then came the moment everyone was waiting for, the moment when the video, the full, unedited recording from my neighbour's camera, was played on the large screen for the court to see. I braced myself as the grainy footage began, my stomach twisting with the shame of seeing my own body slumped in that chair, my wrists bound, my eyes wide with disbelief. The room fell silent as my daughter-in-law's voice rang out clear and mocking, as my sons smirked in the background, as their laughter filled the courtroom, a cruel soundtrack to my humiliation. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look away, refusing to let the shame crush me, because the shame was not mine to carry. It belonged to them, and as the clip ended, as the screen went black, I could feel the shift in the air, the collective intake of breath, the disbelief turning into anger, the doubt collapsing under the weight of undeniable truth. Their lawyer jumped to his feet, trying to spin the video as a misunderstood act of care, arguing that the clip was being weaponized against a loving family. That context was missing. That stress had led to poor choices, but not abuse. But his words rang hollow now, because there it was, projected larger than life, not care, not concern, but cruelty caught in the act. Even the judge, who had once leaned back and questioned my memory, now sat forward with furrowed brows, his eyes fixed on the screen, as though trying to reconcile the polished couple before him with the monsters revealed in the recording. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, my knees trembling, but my voice steady. I did not rehearse or read from notes. I simply spoke from the place inside me that had carried the weight of silence for too long. I told the court about the years of sacrifice, about working multiple jobs to raise my son, about the pride I once carried in watching him walk across the stage at his graduation, about the devastation of realizing that the boy I had loved with, everything in me had grown into a man who saw me as a burden and a bank account. I described the nights of fear, the mornings of humiliation, the way my own home had become a prison, and as I spoke, I saw some in the gallery wipe tears from their eyes. I was not just speaking for myself, but for every elder whose voice had been smothered. Every black grandmother told that her memories were delusions. Every woman whose pain had been minimized because it was easier to believe the abuser's lies than the victim's truth. My son would not meet my gaze as I spoke, his eyes fixed on the floor, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of exposure had finally settled on him. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, glared at me with pure venom, her jaw tight, her nails digging into her lawyer's arm, unwilling to let go of the performance she had perfected. But the court was no longer hers to manipulate. And as the prosecutor closed by demanding accountability, by insisting that what had been done to me was not only immoral, but criminal, the tension in the room reached its peak. The judge called for a recess, and the gallery erupted into murmurs, reporters rushing out to file updates, neighbors whispering their outrage. I sat back down, my chest heaving, my hands still trembling, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that victory was possible, that the tide had fully turned. It was not over yet, but the climax had come. The truth had been spoken, the evidence laid bare, and there was no going back to the shadows. When court resumed, the judge's words cut through the air with finality. He spoke of betrayal, of the abuse of trust, of the unacceptable treatment of a parent who had given her life to her child. He acknowledged the systemic failure that had delayed justice, admitting that my initial plea had been too easily dismissed, and he vowed that the court would not allow such oversight again. He ruled in my favor, granting me full autonomy, declaring my son and daughter-in-law guilty of financial exploitation and unlawful restraint, ordering immediate protective measures to ensure my safety. The gavel struck, and in that moment the room seemed to exhale all at once. My neighbor reached out from the gallery, her hand pressing over her heart, tears in her eyes. Reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing, capturing the faces of the defeated couple who had once thought themselves untouchable. I sat still, letting the words wash over me, the victory both sweet and heavy, because while justice had finally been served, the scars of what had been endured would not vanish overnight. As officers escorted my son and his wife from the courtroom, their faces drained of the power they had once wielded, I did not feel triumph in the way I had imagined. I felt release, a letting go of the constant fear that had shadowed my every breath, and in its place was a quiet strength, the kind that comes not from winning a battle, but from surviving it. The climax had passed. The truth had been exposed before the world, and for the first time in years, I felt the possibility of peace stirring within me. When the courtroom emptied and the echoes of the gavel faded into silence, I felt as if I were walking out into a new world, one where the air itself carried a different weight, lighter but strange, because freedom, once taken and then returned, does not fit easily back into the bones. Reporters crowded near the steps, their microphones thrust forward, their questions sharp and insistent. And though my lawyer advised me to say nothing, I raised my chin and let my voice carry into the microphones. I said that no mother should ever be tied to a chair by the children she raised, that no elder should ever be silenced when she cries for help, and that no system should ever dismiss a woman's truth simply because she has wrinkles on her face or tremors in her hands. My words were not rehearsed. They poured out of me with the weight of decades. And when I saw the nodding heads in the crowd, the tears in the eyes of strangers, I knew I had given voice to more than just my own pain. In the days that followed, my house felt both foreign and familiar. The rooms were the same, the pictures still hung on the walls, the quilt my mother sewed still draped across my bed. But the atmosphere was no longer poisoned by contempt or fear. My son and his wife were gone, their belongings removed by order of the court. And though the quiet was heavy, it was also cleansing, a silence that allowed me to hear my own footsteps again, to breathe without flinching at the sound of a door slamming or a voice rising in anger. I walked from room to room, touching objects I had avoided for months. The china set that had been locked away, the record player gathering dust, the small wooden box of letters from my late husband, and each touch felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. But freedom did not erase the scars. At night, I still woke with my wrists aching as if the ropes were biting into them again. And sometimes when I passed the kitchen chair, I would see myself slumped there, powerless, and the memory would flood back so vividly I had to steady myself. Against the wall. Healing, I realized, was not a sudden light breaking through, but a slow dawn, creeping inch by inch across the horizon. I joined a support group for survivors of elder abuse, women and men who sat in a circle and shared stories so painfully similar to mine that I wondered how many more of us were out there, hidden, silenced, waiting. Their voices, trembling but determined, became a balm, reminding me that survival was not solitude, that my pain was part of a chorus that had long been ignored. The community that had once watched quietly from behind their blinds now stepped forward with open arms. Neighbours invited me to dinners, church members stopped by with flowers and food, and even strangers wrote letters saying my courage had inspired them to speak out about their own hidden struggles. For so long I had believed that my voice was too small, too easily dismissed. But now I saw it ripple outward, touching lives I had never met. It humbled me, but it also fortified me, because dignity restored is not just a private victory. It is a responsibility to carry that flame for others still trapped in the dark. The authorities launched broader investigations, not only into my case but into others across the county, and reforms began to take shape. Policies that once dismissed the complaints of elders as confusion were reviewed, trainings were mandated, and advocates were placed in courthouses to ensure that voices like mine would not be so easily brushed aside again. I watched these changes unfold from my living room chair, the same chair where I had once sat, tied and humiliated, and I felt the strange symmetry of it all, the very space of my pain now becoming the seat of my resilience. My son remained silent in jail, his wife bitter in her appeals. And though part of me still grieved the boy I once cradled in my arms, the man he had become was no longer mine to mourn. I did not visit, I did not write, because forgiveness is not the same as returning to chains, and I had already spent too many years binding myself to duty that was not returned. Instead, I turned toward the future, small steps at first, planting flowers in the yard, attending choir rehearsals again, laughing with women my age about church gossip and arthritis pains, and each small step felt like a rebellion against the attempt to erase me. One afternoon, standing on my porch, I watched children playing in the street, their laughter spilling into the warm air, and I thought about how easily my story could have ended differently. I could have died in silence, my dignity stolen, remembered only as a confused old woman. But instead, I was here, alive, my story carried on television broadcasts, in newspapers, in whispered conversations between families reconsidering how they treated their elders. I whispered a prayer of thanks, not just for survival, but for the strength to fight when every force seemed bent on silencing me. The final act of reclamation came when I gathered the women from my support group and invited them into my home. We sat around the kitchen table, the same table where I had once been bound, and we shared food, laughter, and tears. I told them that this house was no longer a prison, but a sanctuary, that together we could transform places of pain into places of power, that our stories were not shameful, but necessary. Their faces shone with recognition, with relief, with the shared understanding that none of us was alone anymore. As the evening drew to a close and the women hugged me goodbye, I stood at the door, watching them walk into the night, and I felt something in me settle. Justice had not erased the past, but it had given me back my future. The ropes had left marks, but those marks were not chains. They were reminders of the strength it took to break free. And as I closed the door, the house quiet and mine again, I whispered to myself that I was not invisible, not fragile, not erased. I was still here, and I was finally fully free.